The autumn wind whistled through the canyon walls surrounding Jake Hawk Morrison's remote cabin in the Utah Territory, carrying with it the promise of an early winter in 1893. Jake was splitting firewood for the long months ahead when he heard the sound that would change his life forever, the soft whimper of a terrified child. Jake set down his axe and listened carefully, his weather-beaten face creased with concern. Living alone in the wilderness for 12 years had sharpened his senses to detect even the slightest disturbance in the natural rhythm of the mountains. What he heard now was unmistakably human and unmistakably afraid. Following the sound to its source, Jake discovered a small figure huddled behind a boulder near his woodshed. It was a boy, no more than 11 years old, dressed in tattered clothes that had once been fine but were now dirty and torn from hard travel. The child's dark eyes were wide with terror, and he clutched something against his chest with the desperation of someone protecting their most precious possession. "Easy there, son," Jake said gently, crouching down to the boy's eye level. "I'm not going to hurt you. What are you doing way out here?" The boy pressed himself further against the rock, as if trying to disappear entirely. His lips moved soundlessly, and Jake realized the child was too frightened to speak coherently. "You look half-starved," Jake observed, noting the boy's gaunt cheeks and hollow eyes. "When did you last eat?" The boy held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the setting sun, indicating he hadn't eaten in 3 days. Jake's heart went out to this frightened child who had somehow found his way to the most isolated cabin in 50 miles of wilderness. "My name's Jake Morrison, but folks call me Hawk," Jake said, settling cross-legged on the ground to appear less threatening. "What's your name, boy?" The child's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to whisper, "Timothy. Timothy Walsh." "Well, Timothy Walsh," Jake said with a gentle smile. "Why don't you come inside where it's warm? I've got stew on the stove and coffee brewing. Whatever's got you scared, we can figure it out together." Timothy looked at Jake with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. After a long moment, he nodded and allowed Jake to help him to his feet. As they walked toward the cabin, Jake noticed that Timothy never loosened his grip on whatever he was protecting. Inside the warm cabin, Timothy sat at Jake's rough wooden table while Jake served him a bowl of venison stew and a cup of milk. The boy ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't known where his next meal would come from, but his eyes never left Jake's face, watching for any sign of threat. "Timothy," Jake said after the boy had eaten his fill, "you're safe here, but I need to know what brought you to my door." "Are you running from something?" Timothy's eyes filled with tears, and he slowly revealed what he'd been clutching so desperately. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwriting in multiple different hands. The cover was stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. "This belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Hayes," Timothy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was trying to help us kids at Millfield Academy, but they killed her when she got too close to the truth." Jake accepted the journal carefully, noting how Timothy watched his reaction as he began to read the first page. What he found there made his blood run cold. Dr. Hayes had been documenting what appeared to be a systematic operation to traffic children from various orphanages and schools throughout the Utah Territory. The journal entries, written in a physician's precise handwriting, detailed medical examinations of children who showed signs of severe abuse and malnutrition. But as Jake read further, he realized the true scope of what Dr. Hayes had uncovered. The operation wasn't just exploiting children from existing institutions. Someone was actively acquiring orphaned and abandoned children from across the Western Territories, using fraudulent adoption papers and legal guardianship documents to transport them to remote locations where they disappeared from all official records. "Timothy," Jake said, looking up from the journal, "who was running Millfield Academy?" Timothy's face went pale. "Mr. Cornelius Blackthorne," the richest man in the territory. Everyone thinks he's a saint because he funds orphanages and schools, but it's all a lie. He's using them to collect children that nobody will miss. Jake felt his stomach turn. Cornelius Blackthorne was indeed one of the wealthiest and most respected men in Utah Territory, with business interests that included mining, ranching, and banking. His reputation for philanthropy had made him a prominent figure in territorial politics, with influence that reached all the way to Washington. Timothy, how did you escape from Millfield Academy? Jake asked. Timothy wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Dr. Hayes helped me. She'd been asking questions about kids who disappeared, and she found out that Mr. Blackthorne was selling us to people who wanted workers for dangerous jobs. When she tried to report it to the authorities, she discovered that Sheriff Mason and Judge Crawford were being paid to look the other way. Jake turned to another page in the journal and found detailed financial records showing payments made to various officials throughout the territory. The corruption apparently reached into every level of law enforcement and government, creating a network that protected Blackthorne's operation from investigation. The night before they killed Dr. Hayes, Timothy continued, she gave me this journal and told me to find someone honest who could expose the truth. She said there was an old mountain man named Hawk Morrison who lived alone because he couldn't stand corruption, and that he might be the only person in the territory who couldn't be bought or threatened. Jake looked at this brave boy who had risked everything to honor a dead woman's final request. Timothy, what Dr. Hayes documented here is enough to destroy Blackthorne and everyone working with him. But exposing this conspiracy will be extremely dangerous. These people have already killed to protect their secrets. Timothy sat up straighter, his young face showing determination that belied his age. Mr. Morrison, there are still 43 kids trapped at Millfield Academy and 2 other places Dr. Hayes found. If we don't stop Mr. Blackthorne, they're all going to end up dead or worse. Jake studied the journal more carefully, noting that Dr. Hayes had identified specific locations where children were being held and prepared for sale. The operation was larger and more organized than anything he had encountered, even during his years as a territorial marshal, before he'd retreated to mountain isolation. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible Western stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Timothy, Jake said finally, Dr. Hayes trusted you with something that could save dozens of lives. That makes you the bravest boy I've ever met. Now we need to figure out how to get this information to someone who has the authority and integrity to act on it. Timothy's eyes brightened with hope for the first time since arriving at Jake's cabin. Does that mean you'll help? Jake looked at the bloodstained journal, then at the courageous child who had carried it through wilderness that would challenge experienced frontiersmen. Son, I've been hiding from responsibility for 12 years. But some battles choose you whether you want them or not. We're going to make sure Cornelius Blackthorne pays for every child he's hurt. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now to follow this epic Western adventure and discover the shocking extent of Blackthorne's trafficking empire. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the canyon, but inside Jake Morrison's cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. The kind that would either bring justice to the innocent or destroy everyone brave enough to stand against one of the most powerful men in the American West. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows across Jake's cabin walls as he spent the night studying every page of Dr. Hayes' journal. Timothy slept fitfully on the sofa, occasionally crying out from nightmares that Jake could only imagine. The boy had witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Yet he had found the courage to carry crucial evidence across dangerous wilderness to someone who might help. The journal revealed a conspiracy more extensive and organized than Jake had initially comprehended. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes had been methodical in her investigation, documenting not just the abuse of children at Millfield Academy, but an entire network It stretched across multiple territories and involved dozens of officials at every level of government. According to her entries, Cornelius Blackthorne had perfected a system that exploited every weakness in territorial law enforcement. Children were acquired through various means. Some were legitimately orphaned and then never placed with families. Others were taken from families too poor to fight legal battles. And still others were simply abducted from areas where law enforcement was minimal. The journal contained detailed medical records showing that children in Blackthorne's custody suffered from malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological trauma consistent with systematic abuse. Dr. Hayes had documented cases where children, as young as 8 years old, showed signs of having performed dangerous manual labor for extended periods. But the most damning evidence came in the form of correspondence that Dr. Hayes had somehow obtained. Letters between Blackthorne and various business owners discussed the procurement and delivery of suitable workers. With the cold efficiency of livestock transactions, Timothy stirred and sat up, immediately looking toward Jake with anxious eyes. "Did you find everything Dr. Hayes wrote about the other places?" Jake nodded grimly. "She documented 3 separate facilities where children are being held. Besides Millfield Academy, there's something called Sunshine Ranch about 60 miles south of here, and a place called Hope Springs School near the Colorado border." Timothy stood and walked to where Jake sat reading. "Hope Springs is the worst one," he said quietly. "That's where they send kids who try to escape or who ask too many questions." Dr. Hayes said none of the children sent there ever come back. Jake turned to a section of the journal labeled Hope Springs Investigation and found entries that made his hands tremble with rage. Dr. Hayes had managed to visit the facility under the pretense of providing medical care, and what she discovered there defied comprehension. Children at Hope Springs were kept in conditions that could only be described as imprisonment. They worked 16-hour days in dangerous conditions, received minimal food, and were subjected to brutal punishment for any infraction. Those who became too sick or injured to work were simply disposed of, their deaths never reported to any authority. Timothy, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "How many children do you think are being held across all 3 facilities?" Timothy had obviously given this question considerable thought. Dr. Hayes counted at least 90 children when she wrote those entries. But she said Mr. Blackthorne was always bringing in new kids and shipping others out to buyers. So the number changes all the time. Jake stood and walked to his gun cabinet, checking his weapons while his mind worked through the implications of what he'd learned. "Timothy, exposing this operation won't be enough. Even if we get this evidence to honest authorities, Blackthorne has enough money and influence to fight any legal proceedings for years. Meanwhile, those children will continue to suffer." Timothy watched Jake prepare his firearms with the intensity of someone who understood that their lives might depend on the older man's skills. "What are you thinking, Mr. Morrison?" Jake turned to face the boy, his weathered face set with determination. "I'm thinking that sometimes justice can't wait for courts and lawyers. Dr. Hayes died trying to save those children through proper channels. Maybe it's time to try a more direct approach." Timothy's eyes widened. "You mean rescue them?" Jake nodded. "The journal gives us detailed information about the layout of all 3 facilities, guard rotations, and transportation schedules. If we can coordinate our efforts properly, we might be able to free most of the children before Blackthorne realizes what's happening." But Timothy was already shaking his head. "Mr. Morrison, you don't understand how many men Blackthorne has working for him. Dr. Hayes counted at least 20 armed guards at Hope Springs alone, and that doesn't include the overseers and administrators." Jake smiled grimly. "Son, I spent 15 years as a territorial marshal before I came to these mountains. I faced worse odds than that and lived to tell about it." Timothy pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. "Dr. Hayes gave me this too. It's a list of people she thought might help us if we could convince them that the evidence was real." Jake examined the list, recognizing several names. Most were federal officials based in Denver or Salt Lake City, people whose authority superseded territorial jurisdiction. But getting the evidence to them would require a journey of several days, through country that Blackthorne's men would certainly be watching. "There's another problem," Timothy said quietly. "Dr. Hayes wrote that Blackthorne has people watching the mail routes and telegraph lines. Even if we could get a message to honest authorities, he might intercept it before it reaches them." Jake studied the boy's face, seeing wisdom far beyond his years. "Timothy, you're absolutely right. Traditional methods of communication are too risky. We need to deliver this evidence in person to someone who can act on it immediately." "Who?" Timothy asked. Jake pointed to a name on Dr. Hayes' list. "Colonel William McKenna commands the federal garrison at Fort Douglas. He's an old friend from my Marshall days, and he has the authority to conduct military investigations when territorial law enforcement is compromised." Timothy looked hopeful for the philanthropist de Subarville. First time since arriving at Jake's cabin. "How far is Fort Douglas?" "About 150 miles, Jake replied, "through some of the roughest country in Utah Territory. It'll be dangerous, especially with Blackthorne's men looking for you." Timothy stood up straighter, his young face set with resolve. "Dr. Hayes died trying to save those kids, Mr. Morrison. I'm not going to let her sacrifice be for nothing, no matter how dangerous it gets. Don't miss the next chapter of this epic Western adventure. Subscribe to our channel to follow this dangerous mission and discover whether Jake and Timothy can expose Blackthorne's empire before more innocent children disappear forever." Jake looked at this courageous boy who had already risked his life to expose unspeakable evil, and made a decision that would determine the fate of nearly 100 innocent children. "Son," he said, "we're going to honor Dr. Hayes' memory by finishing what she started. But first, we need to gather more evidence and plan our approach carefully. Cornelius Blackthorne has spent years building his operation, but even the most powerful men have weaknesses if you know where to look for them." As the Utah wind continued to howl outside, Jake Morrison began planning the most important mission of his life, knowing that success would mean freedom for dozens of innocent children, while failure would likely result in their deaths and his own. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Utah wilderness as Jake and Timothy prepared for their dangerous journey to Fort Douglas. Jake had spent the early morning hours creating multiple copies of Dr. Hayes' journal, hiding them in various locations around his cabin in case something happened to them on the trail. Timothy proved to be remarkably resilient for someone his age, helping Jake pack supplies and demonstrating survival skills that impressed the experienced frontiersman. The boy had obviously learned much during his time in the wilderness, knowledge that might prove crucial in the days ahead. As they prepared to leave, Timothy revealed information that changed Jake's entire strategy. "Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "there's something else Dr. Hayes told me that wasn't in the journal. Something she made me promise to remember in case the written evidence was destroyed." Jake stopped checking his rifle and gave the boy his full attention. "She found out that Mr. Blackthorne is planning to move all the children from the 3 facilities to a new location next week. Somewhere even more remote where nobody will ever find them." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. "Where?" Timothy pointed toward the distant mountains. "A place called Devil's Canyon, about 40 miles northeast of here. Dr. Hayes said he's built a mining camp there where the children will work until they die. Once they're moved, we'll never be able to rescue them." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If Blackthorne succeeded in consolidating his operation at Devil's Canyon, nearly 100 children would disappear into a location so remote that even territorial authorities would have difficulty reaching it. "Timothy, when is this transfer supposed to happen?" "In 4 days," Timothy replied. Dr. Hayes overheard Mr. Blackthorne giving orders to begin moving the children in small groups starting Monday morning. Jake realized that reaching Fort Douglas and organizing a military response would take longer than 4 days. By the time federal troops could mount an operation, the children would already be beyond rescue. "Son," Jake said, his voice heavy with the weight of an impossible decision, "we can't wait for official help. If those children are going to be saved, we'll have to do it ourselves." Timothy's eyes widened. Just the two of us against all of Blackthorne's men? Jake was already revising his plan, drawing on tactical knowledge gained during years of dangerous law enforcement work. Not just the two of us. According to Dr. Hayes' journal, there are older boys at each facility who might be willing to fight if given the chance. And I know some people in the territory who owe me favors. Over the next hour, Jake sent Timothy to deliver messages to 3 different locations where he knew he could find help. The boy proved to be an excellent messenger, returning with commitments from 2 former deputies and a cavalry sergeant who had served under Jake during the Indian Wars. The plan Jake devised was audacious and extremely dangerous. Instead of trying to rescue children from 3 separate facilities, they would intercept the transport convoy as it moved toward Devil's Canyon. The narrow mountain pass that led to the canyon would force the convoy to travel in single file, making it vulnerable to attack from elevated positions. But success would depend on precise timing and the element of surprise. If Blackthorne's men realized they were under attack before the rescue operation was complete, they would likely kill the children rather than allow them to be liberated. Jake's small force assembled at a predetermined location in the mountains. Jake himself, Timothy, former deputies Carson and Williams, and Sergeant Murphy. Against them would be at least 15 armed guards, plus the drivers and overseers accompanying the transport convoy. The odds were heavily against them, but Jake had faced worse situations during his career as a territorial marshal. More importantly, the alternative, allowing nearly 100 children to disappear into Blackthorne's mining operation, was unacceptable. The convoy appeared exactly when Timothy had predicted, winding through the mountain pass like a deadly snake. Jake counted 6 covered wagons, each carrying children, and guarded by armed outriders. At the front and rear of the convoy rode additional guards, whose job was clearly to prevent exactly the kind of rescue operation Jake had planned. Through his field glasses, Jake could see small faces peering out from under the wagon covers. Children who had no idea that freedom was only minutes away. The attack began when Jake's rifle shot dropped the lead guard from his horse. The narrow confines of the mountain pass worked in favor of the rescue party, preventing Blackthorne's men from spreading out to defend themselves effectively. Timothy, despite his youth, proved invaluable during the battle. His small size allowed him to move through the chaos undetected, reaching the wagons and helping terrified children escape while the adults fought around them. The running battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone involved. When the gunfire finally stopped, 8 of Blackthorne's men were dead or wounded, while the remainder had fled back toward Millfield Academy. More importantly, 87 children were free, ranging in age from 6 to 16 years old. Many were in poor health from their ordeal, but all were alive and finally safe from Blackthorne's operation. The journey to Fort Douglas became a triumphant procession as word of the rescue spread throughout the territory. Colonel McKenna met them with a full medical team and federal marshals, who immediately began documenting the children's testimonies. The trials that followed exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Cornelius Blackthorne was arrested and eventually sentenced to life in prison, while dozens of his accomplices faced justice for their roles in the trafficking network. Subscribe now to our channel for more epic Western stories that celebrate the triumph of good over evil. Timothy Walsh became Jake's adopted son, growing up to become a federal marshal, dedicated to protecting children throughout the American West. His experiences gave him unique insight into the criminal networks that preyed on the innocent, making him one of the most effective law enforcement officers of his generation. Jake Morrison never returned to his isolated mountain cabin. Instead, he established a ranch where rescued children could heal and eventually find loving homes with carefully screened families. His property became known throughout the territory as a place where justice lived and where no child would ever face evil alone. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes was posthumously honored as a hero whose sacrifice had exposed one of the largest child trafficking operations in Western history. A medical school was established in her name, ensuring that her dedication to protecting the innocent would inspire future generations of healers. The journal that had started it all was preserved as evidence in the territorial archives, serving as a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are carried by the smallest hands. It proved that courage comes in all ages, and that evil can only flourish when good people choose to remain silent. This Western story reminds us that true heroism often requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that justice sometimes depends on those who have the least power finding the courage to speak truth to those who have the most.